It is a little after 10 o'clock on the night of September 12th, 1942. The South Atlantic is dark, warm, and empty. A 600-foot ocean liner steams alone through the blackness, 700 miles from the nearest coast, zigzagging across the open ocean as she has been doing for days. No escort, no warships, just the sound of her engines and the quiet hiss of water along her hull. Somewhere out there in the darkness, about 5,000 feet below the surface of the sea, a pair of German torpedoes are moving toward her at over 40 knots. They find her at 10:07 in the evening. The first one punches into her starboard side below the waterline with a concussive blast that the crew feels more than hears. Deep in the ship's cargo holds, men who had been imprisoned there for weeks are hurled against steel walls by the force of the explosion, and many of them never get up again. The second torpedo follows seconds later, striking further forward. The ship immediately begins to list. Water pours into her compartments. Her captain gives the order to abandon ship. More than 2,700 people are aboard the RMS Laconia. By the time the sun rises over the Atlantic the next morning, more than 1,600 of them will be dead. And the man who put those torpedoes into her will spend the next 4 days trying desperately to save as many of those people as he possibly can. What happened next became one of the most remarkable, morally complex, and ultimately tragic episodes of the entire war at sea. It is a story that starts with a single ship and ends with an order that changed the rules of submarine warfare forever. It involved U-boats flying Red Cross flags, an American bomber attack on a rescue mission, and in a post-war trial where the prosecution's star exhibit backfired so badly it practically exonerated the man they were trying to convict. This is the story of the Laconia incident of 1942. A ship called Laconia. The RMS Laconia had a history that stretched back more than 2 decades before the night she was sunk. She was built by Swan, Hunter, and Wygham Richardson at Wallsend in northeast England and launched on April 9th, 1921. The Cunard Line put her to work on their Liverpool to New York transatlantic route, where she spent most of the 1920s carrying emigrants, tourists, and second-class passengers back and forth across the Atlantic. She was not the grandest ship in the Cunard fleet, not in the league of the great Mauretania or Berengaria, but she was a solid, well-regarded vessel, 601 feet long, nearly 20,000 gross tons, capable of carrying up to 2,200 passengers in 3 classes. In November 1922, still fresh from her maiden year, Laconia became the first single ship ever to complete a continuous around-the-world cruise. The American Express Company chartered her for 130 days, and she called at 22 ports across 4 continents, carrying up to 450 leisured passengers through the Panama Canal, across the Pacific, through India, and home again via the Suez Canal. It was the kind of voyage that seemed to belong to a different world entirely, a world of peacetime elegance that, less than 20 years later, would feel almost unimaginable. When the Second World War began in September 1939, the British Admiralty requisitioned the Laconia immediately. By January 1940, she had been fitted with 8 6-inch guns and 2 3-inch high-angle guns, transforming the old liner into an armed merchant cruiser. She spent the next year and a half escorting convoys, patrolling the mid-Atlantic, and doing the unglamorous work of wartime seafaring. In the summer of 1941, she was converted again, this time into a troop ship, stripped of her peacetime passenger accommodations and put to work ferrying men and materials across the oceans of the world. By September 1942, Laconia was on a voyage from Cape Town, South Africa, heading north toward Freetown in Sierra Leone. Her complement that night was a patchwork of wartime necessity. She carried 463 officers and crew, 268 British soldiers, a handful of Polish troops, and roughly 80 civilians, including women and children, among them the wife of the British governor of Malta. She was also carrying 1,793 Italian prisoners of war, captured during the fighting in North Africa, along with 103 Polish soldiers assigned as their guards. The Italians were held in the cargo holds below decks, locked in at night, separated from the rest of the ship by several layers of iron and circumstance. They were Allied Italy's men, soldiers who had surrendered on the desert campaigns of Libya and Egypt, now being transported to prisoner-of-war camps in Britain. They did not know that the waters they were crossing were among the most dangerous on Earth. They did not know that a German submarine was tracking their ship through a periscope. The Man in the Conning Tower. Werner Hartenstein was born on February 27, 1908, in Plauen, in the German state of Saxony. He came from a respectable middle-class family. His father was an export merchant, and after graduating from secondary school, he applied for a naval officer cadetship. He was rejected the first time and spent 2 semesters studying law before the Navy reconsidered. He began his naval career in April 1928, spending years learning his craft on training ships and surface vessels. He eventually commanding torpedo boats during the Spanish Civil War and the opening years of the Second World War. In those first 18 months of the war, Hartenstein completed 65 patrols in the North Sea, the Norwegian waters, the Bay of Biscay, and the English Channel on torpedo boats. He accumulated 2 Iron Crosses and the German Cross in gold, high decorations that marked him as an exceptionally capable officer. In March 1941, he transferred to the U-boat service, and on September 4, 1941, he was given command of U-156, a Type 9C ocean-going submarine. The Type 9C was one of the workhorses of the German U-boat fleet, 251 feet long, capable of diving to around 200 meters, with a range that allowed it to operate in the Caribbean, the South Atlantic, and the waters off the African coast. Hartenstein proved equally effective in the new role. On U-156's second patrol, he shelled the oil refinery on the island of Aruba off Venezuela. Over his first 3 patrols, he sank or damaged more than 20 ships, totaling over 90,000 gross register tons, an impressive tally that earned him Germany's highest military decoration, the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, which he would receive on September 17, 1942, while still at sea. He was, by any measure, one of the most accomplished U-boat commanders operating in the Atlantic. On August 20, 1942, U-156 departed Lorient, France, on its 4th patrol. The boat had been assigned to operate against Allied shipping in the South Atlantic, along the West African coast. It was supposed to be part of a larger operation, a Wolfpack attack codenamed Operation Ijsbeer, targeting the approaches to Cape Town, South Africa. On the night of September 12th, and 156 was running on the surface in the darkness roughly 640 kilometers north of Ascension Island, when lookouts spotted a large vessel. The ship was sailing alone, zigzagging as all unescorted ships did to complicate a torpedo attack. It was big, armed, clearly a legitimate military target. Hartenstein gave the order to attack. He did not know what he was about to find when those torpedoes detonated. The sinking. The 2 torpedoes from U-156 struck the Laconia at 10:07 in the evening. The first one hit forward on the starboard side, detonating in one of the holds where the Italian prisoners were confined. The blast killed dozens of them instantly. The second torpedo, following seconds later, compounded the damage. The ship immediately began to list heavily to starboard and settle by the bow. Captain Rudolph Sharp, a man who had already survived the sinking of another Cunard liner, the Lancastria, in 1940, immediately recognized the severity of the situation and ordered the ship abandoned. The listing that followed was catastrophic in its consequences, and the Laconia carried 32 lifeboats, enough for everyone aboard. But as the ship rolled to starboard, half of those boats became impossible to launch. They were simply tilted in the wrong direction, pressed against the hull by the angle of the list, unable to be freed in time. The boats that could be launched were immediately rushed by the British soldiers and crew members nearest the exits. It was chaos on the upper decks, the universal, terrifying chaos of a large ship sinking in the dark with too many people and too few boats. Down in the holds, the situation was even worse. The Italian prisoners were locked in their cargo compartments when the torpedoes struck. Some managed to break through hatches, climb ventilation shafts, and force their way to the upper decks. Others were trapped in the dark, in rapidly flooding spaces, and they drowned there. Those who did make it to the upper decks found the situation above was barely better. Polish guards with bayonets blocked many of the Italians from reaching the lifeboats, fearful that the boats would be swamped. Survivors later recounted that those Italians who tried to force their way into the boats were repelled by bayonet points, and some who made it to the water and tried to grab the gunwales of loaded lifeboats were beaten back or had their hands cut away by axes wielded by desperate survivors who feared capsizing. The blood in the water summoned the sharks. This part of the South Atlantic was known for them. One Italian survivor, a corporal named Dino Monte, described them afterward. The sharks darting among the people in the water, grabbing limbs, the largest ones taking whole bodies. Of the 1,793 Italian prisoners aboard, only 415 would survive the night and its aftermath. The Laconia sank at 11:23 in the evening, less than 80 minutes after being struck. Her stern rose nearly vertical before she slid into the Atlantic. A Captain Sharp went down with his ship. Out in the dark water, across a wide expanse of ocean, more than 2,000 people struggled to stay alive. Most of them were clinging to wreckage or crowded into the lifeboats that had managed to get clear, or simply swimming, with nothing beneath them but 4,000 meters of cold, dark water. Werner Hartenstein surfaced U-156 nearby, intending to capture the ship's senior officers for intelligence purposes, as was standard practice. He climbed the ladder through the conning tower hatch and looked out at what he had done. What he saw changed everything. The decision that changed history. In the water around him were thousands of people, and among them Hartenstein's crew could hear voices calling out in Italian. They were not British sailors. They were not soldiers. They were prisoners of war, Italy's soldiers, Germany's own allies, dying in the Atlantic. What happened next is one of those moments in history that defies simple explanation. The decision Hartenstein made was not entirely selfless. He was aware that the Italians were German allies and that there would be political and diplomatic consequences if Italy's prisoners of war died en masse through German action. But it also appears to have been genuinely humanitarian. He later described the scene as one that no sailor could witness without acting. Whatever combination of duty, conscience, and practical calculation moved him, the result was the same. He ordered his crew to begin rescue operations. At 1:25 in the morning of September 13th, Hartenstein sent a coded radio message to U-Boat Command, the Befehlshaber der U-Boote, back in France. It read, in substance, "Sunk the British Laconia, unfortunately, with 1,500 Italian prisoners of war, 90 fished out of the water so far. Request orders." Yes, the word "unfortunately" sits in that transmission like a stone. He knew that what he was about to do would compromise his mission and endanger his boat. He was asking for permission to continue anyway. At 6 o'clock in the morning, Hartenstein did something even more remarkable. He broadcast a message in plain English on the international distress frequency. "If any ship will assist the shipwrecked Laconia crew, I will not attack providing I am not being attacked by ship or air forces. I picked up 193 men, 4 degrees, 53 minutes south, 11 degrees, 26 minutes west. German submarine." He repeated the message twice. He was announcing his presence and his intentions to every ship and aircraft within radio range, Allied or otherwise. He was, in effect, declaring a truce and making himself a sitting target in order to save the people in the water. 156 crammed survivors into every space aboard. Below decks, women, children, and the badly injured were brought inside. On the deck above, the foredeck of the submarine, the same surface that would normally be the first thing a depth charge destroyed, men sat and lay in the open air, packed close together, dependent entirely on the good faith of the crew around them. Hartenstein had a large Red Cross flag made from a white bedsheet with a red cross painted on it. He draped it across the gun deck. Then he set about collecting lifeboats. By noon on September 13th, U-156 had 263 survivors on board and was towing several lifeboats containing more. The boat could no longer dive safely. She had too many people on her deck, too many lines in the water. If an aircraft or a warship appeared, Hartenstein would have no way to take her under. He was completely exposed, and he knew it. He kept going anyway. The flotilla grows Admiral Karl Dönitz, while commanding Germany's U-boat fleet from his headquarters in France, received Hartenstein's message and faced a dilemma. Hitler, informed of the situation, was furious and initially ordered the rescue abandoned. Prisoners of war were the enemy's problem, not Germany's. Admiral Erich Raeder, commanding the German Navy, stepped in and rerouted the plan. The largest wolf pack, the Eisbär boats intended for the Cape Town attack, were redirected. Dönitz ordered 3 submarines to converge on Hartenstein's position. U-506, commanded by Kapitänleutnant Erich Würdemann. U-507, under Korvettenkapitän Harro Schacht, and the Italian submarine Commandante Capellini. Dönitz also made contact with the Vichy French authorities in West Africa. The Vichy French, nominally neutral, collaborating with German occupation, maintaining their own government and military, had ships in the region. They dispatched the cruiser Gloire from Dakar and 2 smaller sloops, and the Annamite and the Dumont d'Urville from ports in French Guinea and Dahomey. The French ships were expected to arrive on the scene by the morning of September 17th. The plan, roughly, was for the submarines to act as a temporary lifeboat fleet, holding survivors together in the water, and then transfer them all to the French vessels when they arrived. U-506 reached the rescue area on September 14th. U-507 arrived that afternoon. The Italian submarine Capellini joined shortly after. All 4 vessels flew improvised Red Cross flags. All 4 had their decks crowded with survivors. All 4 were towing strings of lifeboats behind them. The combined flotilla, moving slowly westward across the South Atlantic toward the approaching French ships, carried somewhere over 1,000 people. Injured men and women lay on the hard metal of submarine decks under the sun. The German and Italian crews shared their food and water rations with the survivors. British officers who had been enemies hours earlier found themselves side by side with German sailors, communicating through gestures and broken English. Hartenstein spoke good English, and British survivors later recalled his behavior with a mixture of surprise and genuine respect. A Royal Navy commander named Geoffrey Greet, one of those pulled from the water, said afterward that it became obvious Hartenstein was a much better man than they had expected. He was trying to help the women and children. He was desperate to save the Italians. He sat in open water, a decorated U-boat commander, completely unable to dive, risking his crew and his boat out of what appeared to be a genuine sense of obligation to the people in the water around him. None of this changed what was coming. The attack. September 16th, 1942. And the rescue flotilla has been at sea for 4 days. The submarines have become somewhat separated from one another during the night. U-156 is alone, surrounded by lifeboats, her deck crowded with survivors, her Red Cross flag spread out across the gun platform. She is 700 miles from the nearest coast. There is no other ship in sight. At around 9:30 in the morning, a large American aircraft appears in the sky. It is a B-24 Liberator heavy bomber, assigned to the 343rd Bombardment Squadron and flying out of a secret American base on Ascension Island, an isolated British-administered island in the mid-South Atlantic that the United States had been using as a staging point for aircraft transiting to Africa and beyond. The pilot is Lieutenant James D. Harden. He is on a routine anti-submarine patrol. From the air, what Harden sees is a German submarine on the surface, surrounded by lifeboats with people on the deck. He radios his position to the Ascension Island base and asks for instructions. The senior officer on duty that day is Captain Robert C. Richardson III. He later claimed he was unaware that this was a German rescue operation. His reasoning, pieced together from various post-war accounts, was this. He believed the rules of war did not permit a combat vessel to fly Red Cross flags. He feared the U-boat might attack Allied merchant ships that had been diverted toward the area, and he was concerned that if the submarine discovered the secret American airfield on Ascension Island, it might shell it. He gave Harden the order, "Sink the sub." From U-156, Hartenstein's crew attempted to signal the aircraft by flashing light in Morse code. One transmission sent by a Royal Air Force officer among the survivors read, "This is an RAF officer aboard German submarine. There are Laconia survivors, soldiers, civilians, women, children." The attempts at communication failed, and nobody aboard the B-24 could read Morse code well enough to understand the messages. The aircraft circled the submarine for about 30 minutes and then turned away. Hartenstein's crew began to hope the danger had passed. The B-24 came back. At 12:32 in the afternoon, Harden made his attack run at around 250 feet above the water. He released bombs and depth charges. On the first 3 passes, the depth charges failed to release. On the 4th pass, bombs fell. One landed among the lifeboats being towed behind 156. It capsized one boat and killed dozens of the survivors inside it. Another bomb straddled U-156 itself, blowing a delayed action detonation beneath the submarine's control room and causing significant internal damage. On his deck full of survivors, the message was unmistakable. Hartenstein had no choice. He ordered the tow lines cut. He ordered the survivors on the deck into the water. The submarine began to submerge slowly, giving those on the deck time to get into the water and to reach the floating lifeboats now drifting away. Then U-156 went under to save herself. Hardin's report, filed after the mission, stated that the submarine had been observed to roll over and sink. He was wrong. U-156 was damaged but survived. His crew was later awarded Air Medals for what was recorded as the sinking of a German submarine. No one was punished. No inquiry was held. The Americans, for years afterward, were largely silent about what had happened. The survivors left in the water after the attack faced a further ordeal that lasted for days. 2 lifeboats decided, against Hartenstein's specific instructions, to stay in the area for rescue, to try to row the 700 miles to the African coast. One boat, which had started with 68 people, reached the coast 27 days later with only 16 survivors. The other was found by a British trawler after 40 days at sea, with just 4 of its original 52 occupants still alive. And the Vichy French ships arrived the following day and began collecting the survivors who had stayed in the area. In total, of the 2,732 people aboard the Laconia when the torpedoes struck, approximately 1,083 survived. The death toll of around 1,658 people made it one of the worst maritime disasters of the war. Worse, in terms of lives lost, than the sinking of the Titanic. Of those who died, approximately 1,420 were Italian prisoners of war. The Order. On September 17, 1942, the day after the attack on his rescue flotilla, Admiral Karl Dönitz composed an order and transmitted it across the encrypted radio channels to every submarine in the German fleet. It was formally designated Triton Null. History would know it by a different name, the Laconia Order. Its key passage read, "All attempts to save survivors of sunken ships, such as the fishing out of swimming men and putting them on board lifeboats, the righting of overturned lifeboats, or the handing over of food and water must stop. Rescue contradicts the most basic demands of the war, the annihilation of enemy ships and their crews." Another passage was even blunter. "We are building U-boats, not rescue ships." The language was cold, functional, and completely final. Until September 1942, German U-boat commanders had operated under what was known as the cruiser rules, a set of maritime conventions that called for warning merchant ships before sinking them where possible, and for making provision for their crews to reach safety. These rules had already been eroded significantly by the realities of the war, but they had never been entirely abandoned. Many U-boat commanders had provided food and water to survivors they encountered. Some had directed lifeboats toward the nearest coast. Some had rendered medical assistance to injured sailors in the water. After the Laconia Order, all of that stopped. The order was explicit: no rescue of any kind. Under any circumstances, if a submarine encountered survivors in the water, those survivors were to be left there. Dönitz later stated that the attack on Hartenstein's rescue operation had demonstrated conclusively that a surfaced U-boat engaged in humanitarian activities was a dead U-boat. He was not wrong about the military logic. The moment a submarine came to the surface, whatever its reason for being there, it was vulnerable. The Atlantic sky increasingly belonged to Allied aircraft. Staying on the surface to rescue survivors was asking to be killed. The consequences of the order were felt for the rest of the war by thousands of sailors on Allied merchant vessels whose ships were sunk in the Atlantic. Many of them, who might have received assistance, water, food, a bearing toward land, received nothing at all. Some died of thirst in lifeboats within sight of the coast they could not quite reach. Some were left in the water with no boats at all and no hope of rescue. The Laconia order did not cause all of these deaths, but it removed from the equation the possibility of mercy that had occasionally, unpredictably, saved lives in the early years of the war. It was, in its own way, as significant a turning point as any battle in the Atlantic. The reckoning at Nuremberg. The war ended in May 1945 with Germany's unconditional surrender. Karl Dönitz, who had briefly served as Germany's head of state after Hitler's suicide, was arrested and brought to stand trial at the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, alongside the surviving senior leadership of the Third Reich. He was indicted on 3 counts: conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, planning and waging aggressive war, and crimes against the laws of war. And the Laconia Order was the central exhibit in the prosecution's war crimes case against him. It was, from the Allied prosecution's perspective, a compelling piece of evidence. Here was an order signed by Dönitz, in his own words, explicitly instructing U-boat commanders to let survivors die. It appeared on the surface to be a direct order to abandon the ancient maritime obligation to rescue the shipwrecked. Under international law, as the prosecution understood it, it could be read as a war crime. What the prosecution had not fully reckoned with was what would happen when the German defense was allowed to put the Laconia incident itself into the record. The story of Hartenstein's rescue effort, his 4 days on the surface, the Red Cross flag, the hundreds of survivors, the open radio broadcasts in English, the attack by an American aircraft. None of this had been widely known before the trial. When it came out in the courtroom, it fundamentally changed the moral landscape of the case. Here was the context in which the Laconia Order had been issued, not as an act of deliberate cruelty, but as a direct response to Allied aircraft bombing a German rescue mission flying a Red Cross flag. Then the defense produced something even more devastating to the prosecution's case. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, the wartime commander-in-chief of the United States Pacific Fleet, provided a written statement on Dönitz's behalf. It stated, without apology or qualification, that the United States Navy had waged unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan in the Pacific from the very first day the United States entered the war in December 1941. American submarines had been operating under their own version of the Laconia Order since Pearl Harbor. Captain Robert C. Richardson, the man who had ordered Hardin to bomb the rescue mission, was never investigated, never disciplined, never charged with anything. The International Military Tribunal found that the evidence did not establish with sufficient certainty that Dönitz had deliberately ordered the killing of shipwrecked survivors. The tribunal said the orders were ambiguous and that they deserved strong censure, but that Dönitz could not be convicted on the specific war crimes charge that related to the Laconia order. He was convicted of other counts, waging aggressive war and crimes against the laws of submarine warfare more broadly, and sentenced to 10 years in prison. He served the full term at Spandau Prison in Berlin, was released in October 1956, and lived in a village near Hamburg until his death in December 1980 at the age of 89. The B-24 crew that attacked the Laconia rescue mission was never charged with anything. Neither was Captain Richardson. In 1993, a United States Department of Defense legal study concluded that the attack constituted a war crime, and that the officer who ordered it and the pilot who carried it out were both, in the language of the assessment, prima facie guilty of a war crime. By 1993, everyone involved was long dead. What happened afterward? Werner Hartenstein did not live to see the aftermath of what he had set in motion. On September 17, 1942, the same day Dönitz issued the Laconia order, U-156 received a radio message informing Hartenstein that he had been awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, Germany's highest military decoration. He gave each member of his crew a bottle of beer, held a brief ceremony, and told them he would wear the decoration in their name. Then U-156 continued her patrol. On the boat's fifth patrol, on March 8, 1943, U-156 was operating approximately 100 miles east of Barbados, when a United States Navy PBY Catalina flying boat from Patrol Squadron 53 found her on the surface. The aircraft dropped 4 depth charges that straddled U-156, lifting the submarine and breaking her apart. At least 11 men were seen in the water afterward. The Americans dropped 2 rubber rafts. 5 survivors were seen to reach one of them. The USS Barney was dispatched from Trinidad. By March 12th, the search had been abandoned. Werner Hartenstein, the man who had stopped his submarine over 1,000 people in the water and spent 4 days risking his life and his boat to save them, was gone. He was 35 years old. None of the survivors from U-156's crew were ever found. And the RMS Laconia lies today at the bottom of the South Atlantic at a depth of approximately 4,230 meters, deeper than the Titanic. She was never salvaged. Her wreck has never been commercially dived. Most of the people who died in her sinking, the 1,420 Italian prisoners of war, the crew members and soldiers, the civilians, have no marked grave anywhere on Earth. They are still down there, in the dark, 4 miles below the surface of the ocean. The Laconia order remained in force until the end of the war. The weight of it. What do we do with a story like this? There is no clean morale to pull from the Laconia incident. Hartenstein sank a ship and then tried to rescue its survivors. His motives were probably mixed: Allied solidarity with Italy, genuine human conscience, the instincts of a professional sailor who understood the sea. His efforts were undermined and ultimately destroyed by an attack from the very people he was trying to help. And the order that followed his rescue attempt cost far more lives than his rescue could ever have saved. The Americans who attacked the rescue mission were following orders in a war where every surfaced submarine was a genuine threat, where the rules of engagement were written in the blood of thousands of Atlantic sailors. Captain Richardson's reasoning, whatever we think of his decision, was not crazy by the logic of the conflict. He was wrong about what the rules permitted, and wrong about what he could actually see from his own position. But he was operating in a world where German submarines had been sinking undefended merchant ships and leaving their crews to die for 3 years. Dönitz issued an order that condemned unknown numbers of shipwrecked men to death over the following 3 years of the war. He did it in response to an act that was itself arguably a war crime. The whole thing is an ugly, a tangled knot that resists being pulled apart cleanly. What remains, underneath all of it, is a single image. A German submarine on the surface of the South Atlantic, flying a Red Cross flag made from a bedsheet, with hundreds of people of 5 different nationalities crowded on its deck and trailing behind it in lifeboats, moving slowly toward rescue in the morning light. 4 days, more than 1,000 people, one boat that could not dive. That image existed. Whatever happened next, it existed. These stories deserve to be remembered for exactly what they were: complicated, contradictory, and human. If this story moved you, hit the like button below. It helps this channel reach more people who care about the full, unvarnished history of the Second World War. Subscribe to WWII Tales so you never miss the next one, and turn on notifications so you hear about it first. At the stories that don't fit neatly into simple narratives of good and evil are often the ones that tell us the most about who we actually are. I'll see you in the next one.